Let's get to Tim Walz, who, just when you think no one's sitting at this table, neither she nor the big white blanket, can embarrass themselves any further, he does. She asks him, to her credit, about the carrying the weapons in war, which we know is a lie. He never served in war. He's been stealing valor for quite some time. And take a listen to this answer.
Say, hey, when there's a problem, you call a man. The Democrats can't even tell you what a man is.
So when you hear Walz brag about how much of a man he is, what does that tell you?
I think there might be a little bit of a cope there, you could say. There's a little bit, he has to remind us how masculine he is, trying to not even be able to load a shotgun or fix a truck.
You said that you carried weapons in war, but you have never deployed actually in a war zone. A campaign official said that you misspoke. Did you?
Well, first of all, I'm incredibly proud. I've done 24 years of wearing the uniform of this country. Equally proud of my service in a public school classroom, whether it's Congress or the governor. My record speaks for itself, but I think people are coming to get to know me. I speak like they do. I speak candidly. I wear my emotions on my sleeves, and I speak especially passionately about our children being shot in schools.
I'll tell you one thing. The most masculine thing that someone can do in America today is stand up for women that are not able to stand up for themselves.
Right.
So while Tim Walz is going on Gavin Newsom's podcast, attacking me, by the way, saying that I'm a bad guy, well, I'm sorry, Governor Walz. One thing that we don't have in common is, unlike you in Minnesota, I, every single day, am actually fighting for female privacy in locker rooms and that women's sports will not have men in them. Real men stand up for women when they're not able to stand up for themselves.
Walz stood before reporters confidently bragging about how he handled weapons during combat. It was a bold assertion, except it wasn't accurate. He had never been stationed in an actual war zone. And this wasn't just a minor mistake. It was part of a consistent pattern, a rehearsed act meant to impress voters. But when Megyn Kelly and Charlie Kirk heard the claim, they didn't just question it, they brought proof.
The idea that you said that you were in war. Did you misspeak, as the campaign has said?
Yeah, I said we were talking about, in this case, this was after a school shooting, the ideas of carrying these weapons of war. And my wife, the English teacher, told me my grammar's not always correct. But again, if it's not this, it's an attack on my children for showing love for me, or it's an attack on my dog.
This is a sacred trust. In the spring of 2005, Walz walked away from that sacred trust, abandoning his post when he learned of an upcoming Iraq deployment. This is Senecal Pubula saying this. He is a coward. According to this Twitter feed, he is a quitter. And every veteran I've talked to thinks that Walz is close to betraying the country by doing it.
They labeled it what many already suspected, stolen valor. Pretending to be a hero just to gain political influence. That's not only deceitful, it's shameful. You see, Walz had shaped a large part of his political identity around his supposed military background, donning the uniform and presenting it as proof of his toughness and patriotism. But once confronted, he started to retreat. First, he called it a misunderstanding. Then he blamed poor wording, then emotions, and even school shootings. It was one excuse after another. Meanwhile, real veterans began speaking out. To them, it wasn't just a falsehood, it was a betrayal.
What Walz did is the moral equivalent of a mother dropping off her 5 preteen children at an orphanage in the dead of night so that she could run for Congress. Yes, it is that bad. This was more than just abandoning troops. It also reflects a major personal deficit in his character and makeup. By the way, this is written by a veteran.
One veteran even likened his behavior to deserting fellow troops just to chase political ambition. And that was only the start. By the way, before we move on, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us expand and bring you more compelling stories like this one. Now, let's get back to it.
The idea that you said that you were in war. Did you misspeak, as the campaign has said?
Yeah, I said we were talking about, in this case, this was after a school shooting, the ideas of carrying these weapons of war. And my wife, the English teacher, told me my grammar's not always correct. But again, if it's not this, it's an attack on my children for showing love for me, or it's an attack on...
Tim Walz wasn't just exposed for stretching the truth about his military background. his whole leadership persona started falling apart under scrutiny. He talks a big game, portraying himself as relatable, emotional, passionate, a down-to-earth guy who tells it like it is. But Megyn Kelly and Charlie Kirk weren't convinced. What they saw was a man more focused on appearances than accomplishments. His speeches were loaded with emotional pauses and sincere-sounding words, but when it came to real leadership, it was all theater and no depth.
Tim Walz then lied about it to run for Congress and acted as if he was on the front lines. And people in Walz's battalion died. People under his supervision died. If Master Sergeant retired Walz could not be trusted to fulfill his duties he had to his soldiers, his unit, and his nation in 2005, how can he be trusted to be vice president in 2020?
He went out of his way to label himself masculine, as if that somehow made up for his lack of real action. But as Charlie Kirk pointed out, how manly is someone who can't even load a shotgun or fix a truck, yet pretends to be a warrior? While real men and women were putting their lives on the line, Walz was busy snapping photos, doing easy interviews, and fine-tuning his public image like he was auditioning for a documentary. That wasn't leadership, it was performance. Megyn and Charlie tore through that facade, exposing how Walz constantly deflected blame, never owning up to anything, always dodging accountability. When schools underperformed, it was the system's fault. When protests spiraled into riots, it was just poor communication. And when he got caught in a lie, suddenly it became a grammar issue, or just a simple mix-up.
What kind of bullshit is that? No, you don't, sir. We don't lie about military service we didn't actually perform, like going to war. We don't steal valor by saying that we had a higher rank in the National Guard than we did. We don't run around saying we served in operating Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan when we didn't. We don't stand and watch somebody say that we were in combat in Iraq when we weren't.
That wasn't just weak, it was downright offensive. And as we dig deeper, it becomes clear this wasn't a one-time slip-up. It was a consistent pattern, and things only spiraled from there. Then came the pandemic, and that's when Tim Walz's carefully crafted image really started to crack. At a time when calm, reliable leadership was crucial, Walz became what Megyn Kelly described as a part-time epidemiologist running a full-time fear campaign. His lockdown mandates hit small businesses like a sledgehammer. Family-owned shops were forced to close, many for good. Meanwhile, giant corporations were conveniently labeled essential and kept running like nothing had changed. It wasn't guided by science, it was driven by appearances.
Podcast attacking me, by the way, saying that I'm a bad guy. Well, I'm sorry, Governor Walz. One thing that we don't have in common is, unlike you in Minnesota, I every single day am actually fighting for female privacy in locker rooms, and that women's sports will not have men in them. Real men.
And Walz made sure he was front and center for every carefully staged moment. Press briefings, vaccine photo ops, emotional speeches. He worked every angle for the cameras. Charlie Kirk didn't pull any punches either. He dug into the numbers and exposed how hospital capacity projections were wildly inaccurate. The policies kept shifting based on political convenience, not public health. Schools were shut down while bars and liquor stores stayed open. None of it added up, unless you recognized it for what it truly was, panic management, not genuine leadership. And when people began demanding answers,
yourself from that clarification. And then here's two pieces of this that are really, I speak like they do. People are coming to get to know me. I speak like they do. I speak candidly. I wear my emotions on my sleeves, and I speak especially passionately about, and then he goes on to blame it on the school shootings. I guess he was upset about school shootings, so he lied. But stop saying you speak like we do.
Walz vanished. When the consequences hit, when cities burned, students fell behind, and communities pleaded for help, he was nowhere to be found. It was like he disappeared the very moment real leadership was required. While families were fighting to get by, he stood at press conferences with a smile, pretending everything was under control. But the truth was out, and Megyn and Charlie were only getting started. Charlie Kirk wasn't about to ignore the economic collapse. He went straight after Walz's financial track record. What he exposed was devastating. Minnesota was raking in a massive amount of tax revenue, tens of billions pouring into the state. Yet, whenever it came time to solve actual problems, there was somehow never enough funding. Roads were falling apart. Schools were failing. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Charlie called it reverse alchemy, turning gold into potholes, and he wasn't wrong. Despite sky-high taxes, the most essential services were crumbling.
Fallout continues for Tim Walz on the disastrous performance he delivered, in particular when it comes to his self-described knuckle-headed behavior, which was just his latest in a series of lies. The reason he resorted to, I'm a knucklehead, was he got confronted with his latest lie that's been unearthed. There's a long list of them. This one was that he was in China when the Tiananmen Square disaster unfolded, when hundreds of people were killed. You know whether you were in a place where hundreds of people are being massacred by their government.
Charlie mocked Walz's version of prosperity, creating more government jobs while hammering the private sector. Regulations spun out of control. Small businesses were drowning in bureaucracy. Entrepreneurs, once considered the pride of Minnesota, were packing up and moving out. And Walz? He acted like this was progress. But it wasn't just poor leadership, it was open hostility toward success. Charlie compared it to watching a snowstorm paralyze a city, and instead of clearing the roads, Walz kept dumping more snow and calling it job creation. And this wasn't some accident, it was intentional. A clear pattern of turning every economic issue into a government project, then blaming the private sector when it inevitably failed. As businesses shut down, Walz kept posing for cameras. As unemployment soared, he praised his own policies. But the numbers didn't lie. Under his leadership, the economy didn't just slow down, it suffocated. And next came education, where the collapse was even more dramatic. You'd think a former teacher would know how to protect schools. But under Tim Walz, Minnesota's education system didn't just falter, it completely fell apart.
If it's not this, it's an attack on my children for showing love for me, or it's an attack on my dog.
This took chutzpah. Let's go through it. You said you carried weapons in war, but you've never deployed in a war zone. A campaign official of yours said you misspoke. Did you? Well, I'm proud, incredibly proud of my record. He keeps doing this. Equally proud of my service in the classroom. Did I mention I was a teacher and a coach, an assistant coach? Okay, whatever. But he's more stolen valor. In the classroom, I'm in the classroom. My record speaks for itself. It doesn't, actually. You've put a lot of lies into that record that you've been called out on by service personnel.
Charlie mocked Walz's version of prosperity, creating more government jobs while hammering the private sector. Regulations spun out of control. Small businesses were drowning in bureaucracy. Entrepreneurs, once considered the pride of Minnesota, were packing up and moving out. And Walz? He acted like this was progress. But it wasn't just poor leadership, it was open hostility toward success. Charlie compared it to watching a snowstorm paralyze a city, and instead of clearing the roads, Walz kept dumping more snow and calling it job creation. And this wasn't some accident, it was intentional. A clear pattern of turning every economic issue into a government project, then blaming the private sector when it inevitably failed. As businesses shut down, Walz kept posing for cameras. As unemployment soared, he praised his own policies. But the numbers didn't lie. Under his leadership, the economy didn't just slow down, it suffocated. And next came education, where the collapse was even more dramatic. You'd think a former teacher would know how to protect schools. But under Tim Walz, Minnesota's education system didn't just falter, it completely fell apart.
Disgusting, repulsive, and reprehensible examples of abandoning one's unit, of turning back on country and instead for own personal comfort and safety that we have ever seen in politics. And it's far worse than I even think people are describing it. It is worse than stolen valor. It is abandoning your fellow soldier.
Charlie came in armed with hard facts. This wasn't some post-COVID dip, it was systemic failure. Walz's leadership had been falling short long before the pandemic ever hit. His obsession with political safety meant he never made bold moves, never challenged the unions when it counted, and never delivered anything beyond empty catchphrases. Worse, when frustrated parents began pulling their kids from public schools, Walz didn't stop to ask why. He didn't course correct. Instead, he blamed outside influences, dismissed concerns as misinformation, and moved on like it didn't matter. The result? A generation of students left behind, and a governor who refused to take any responsibility. And if that sounds bad, things only got uglier when it came to culture and gender policy. In the thick of cultural battles and gender debates, Tim Walz tried to straddle both sides, but pleased no one in the process. Megyn Kelly didn't hold back. She slammed him for always sitting on the fence, calling him the political equivalent of lukewarm soup. Walz liked to pose as the steady hand, the sensible moderate. But behind the calm voice was someone enabling extreme agendas while hiding behind smooth rhetoric and a soft-spoken Minnesota accent. One minute he's on a podcast criticizing political opponents, the next he's dead silent as girls lose privacy in locker rooms and women's sports are sidelined. Yet he still tries to brand himself as a defender of women. But as Charlie Kirk made clear, real men don't just make speeches, they take action. And Walz wasn't taking action. He was playing a role. Carefully scripted, always vague, never willing to take a stand. His speeches were full of empathy, but when critical moments came, he offered compromise instead of courage, confusion instead of clarity. Charlie said it plain. He wasn't a leader, he was a puppet for party politics. When donors and activists said jump, Walz didn't push back. He asked how high. Meanwhile, regular Minnesotans were left struggling with unclear policies, social tension, and eroding trust. Through it all, Walz just kept smiling for the cameras. But the most devastating part was still ahead. Because when the streets of Minnesota erupted in flames and chaos took over, what Walz didn't do is what people remember most. After the George Floyd protests turned violent, Minnesota's streets became unsafe fast. Police forces were overwhelmed and morale sank. Officers who once proudly protected communities felt defunded, demonized, and abandoned. As crime surged and fear spread, residents were left wondering where their governor had gone. Megyn Kelly tore into his delayed response. Walz waited too long to deploy the National Guard, allowing the situation to spiral. And when he finally did act, he minimized the destruction, blaming miscommunication instead of admitting failure. That wasn't caution. It was cowardice. While citizens were left to defend themselves, Walz focused on crafting statements. Charlie Kirk didn't let up either. He exposed the hard numbers, skyrocketing police resignations, surging shootings, and record-high insurance claims. He made it clear, Walz's soft-on-crime approach turned public safety into a political debate rather than a core duty. When people begged for leadership, Walz gave more press conferences full of emotion but no solutions. As families boarded up broken businesses, Walz posed for another photo op. The result was undeniable. Under his leadership, law and order became just another slogan. Those who depended on him for protection felt abandoned, deceived, and left with nothing but empty promises. Then came the final, most painful blow. Education, the economy, and public safety were all collapsing, but it was the stolen valor and abandoned service that hit the hardest. Charlie Kirk closed with one of the most brutal revelations yet. In 2005, Walz allegedly walked away from his military role after learning his unit might be sent to Iraq. Veterans didn't call it a mistake, they called it betrayal. Soldiers under his leadership lost their lives. Yet Walz later ran for Congress, cloaked in patriotism, pretending to be a battle-hardened warrior. One veteran said what Walz did wasn't just stolen valor, it was something worse. It wasn't just pretending to be a hero. It was. He left people behind. And instead of confronting that reality, Walz deflected, talking about his background as a teacher, as a coach. He smiled and repeated his go-to line, "My record speaks for itself." But Megyn Kelly wasn't buying it, and neither was Charlie. They laid it out clearly. His record was built on half-truths, rewritten history, and carefully crafted messaging meant to win elections, not reveal the truth. They shredded the polished political image. Every emotional moment, every "I'm just like you" statement now felt artificial, not just fake, but cold and calculated. It wasn't about serving Minnesota, it was about building a brand. And behind that brand was a man who talked big, acted small, and led from behind while pretending to be out front. After dismantling his false military narrative, Megyn and Charlie focused on his media strategy, and it was just as orchestrated. Walz didn't face tough questions unless the interviewer was friendly and the script was approved. The interviews were softballs. Reporters were handpicked. Press conferences were stage-managed. Megyn pointed out that his idea of transparency was letting cameras film him reading a statement written by staffers he barely spoke to. That wasn't leadership, it was public relations. Charlie compared it to a college group project, where Walz showed up at the end, read the conclusion, and expected full credit. Meanwhile, in the real world, schools were falling apart, businesses were collapsing, and families were running out of hope. But none of that made it into the press releases. Those were full of buzzwords and performative empathy. When teachers were burning out, Walz hosted a roundtable with his political allies and called it reform. When crime surged, he tweeted. When the healthcare system faltered, he gave another speech. Always the face of concern. Never the man with a solution. And Minnesotans noticed. They weren't getting answers, they were getting theater. Carefully timed, emotionally charged, strategically vague. But Megyn and Charlie weren't chasing a script, they were chasing truth. And the more layers they peeled back, the more they revealed a governor hiding behind consultants and media teams while the state he claimed to serve quietly unraveled. Then came the collapse in two critical areas, healthcare and immigration. Walz entered office promising reform. Less red tape, better access, and stronger rural care. But the results were dismal. Wait times increased. Rural hospitals struggled to stay staffed. And the only thing growing wasn't care, it was bureaucracy. New committees. New task forces. New talking points. Megyn Kelly nailed it. This was the only healthcare plan in America that made people feel sicker just watching it. Doctors were frustrated. Patients were waiting weeks. And all Walz offered were more meetings, more nodding, more excuses. There was no plan, just another slow-motion disaster wrapped in press-friendly language. Then came immigration. Walz's stance was fuzzy at best. Vague words, no clear policies, sanctuary declarations, symbolic gestures, and open-door rhetoric that ignored the real pressure on local towns. Communities already overwhelmed with housing shortages and job scarcity were expected to absorb more, with no funding, no framework, no plan. Charlie called it out. This wasn't compassion. It was chaos dressed in comforting words. And once again, Walz smiled through the confusion. But this wasn't just mismanagement. It was deeper, more dangerous. Megyn made sure people didn't forget that. This is where it all came full circle. She ended the breakdown by spotlighting what she called the culture of complacency under Tim Walz. Under his watch, mediocrity wasn't just tolerated, it became the standard. Failure was no longer failure, it was transition. Crises weren't solved, they were rebranded. And every screw-up was followed by a slick press release that blamed the system instead of holding leadership accountable. This wasn't just about politics, it was about trust. About being present when it counts. And time after time, Walz wasn't. Charlie agreed. This wasn't red versus blue, it was results versus excuses. Minnesota didn't get a leader. It got a manager in snow boots, reading lines from a script. Optimism got replaced with spin. Action got traded for delay. And real leadership? It was buried under empty applause and carefully staged empathy. Megyn and Charlie left no stone unturned. Military service lies, economic decay, broken education, public safety failures, crumbling healthcare, reckless culture policy, media manipulation, and silence in the face of chaos. They didn't just criticize, they exposed. What was left standing wasn't a strong leader. It was a man who talked tough, posed confidently, but governed like someone always waiting for someone else to make the first move. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next video.